Hi folks, it's a pleasure to be here today. Today I want to speak about performance not just as representation but as action, as a tool that can disrupt, provoke and ultimately reshape how we relate to non-human animals. My focus is on how creative practices, particularly performance in activist contexts, can cultivate interspecies empathy, raise awareness and inspire change. I'll draw on both theoretical ideas and real-world examples to show how performance can function as a mode of direct intervention, not just education. This is especially urgent in the context of the ecological and ethical crisis, where traditional communication often fails to move people. Performance invites us to feel, to be implicated, and to reimagine. To ground this talk, I want to highlight two key theoretical threads: trauma and anthropocentrism. Firstly, trauma. Patrick Duggan writes about the unique way performance can engage with trauma, not simply by portraying suffering, but by enacting it in a way that is felt. Performance enables us to bear witness, not from a distance, but from within. It becomes a kind of ritualized exposure where the audience doesn't just see suffering, but is drawn into its emotional and bodily rhythms. This idea is central when we consider non-human animal suffering. So much of it is deliberately hidden, behind slaughterhouse walls, inside laboratories, or buried under euphemisms. Performance has the capacity to reintroduce that hidden trauma into public space in a form that is embodied, effective, and disruptive. Secondly, anthropocentrism. Laura Cull's work critiques the human tendency to recenter ourselves, even in attempts to decenter. We say we care about non-human animals, our ecosystems, but always through the lens of human impact or human emotion. Performance, I believe, can challenge this by inviting us into relational bodily encounters that exceed the rational. It can momentarily break what Cull calls the anthropocentric circle. These are not just abstract ideas. In the examples I'll now share, we see how theory becomes practice, how performances can embody trauma, challenge species hierarchy, and invite us to feel with rather than for non-human animals. One example I often return to is Duck Lake by Yvette Watt. Created in 2016, this performance reimagines Swan Lake through the lives and deaths of hunted ducks. On the surface, it borrows from familiar classical aesthetic, the poised, precise movement of ballet. But what it does is invert and disrupt that language. On a Tasmanian lagoon, Watt and activists set up a floating stage on the opening day of a duck shooting season. Activists had been attending for years to bear witness, protest, and disrupt. This year, activists dressed in pink tutus and enacted their Duck Lake. Throughout the performance, the activists and performers' bodies moved between elegance, clumsiness, and collapse. There are sequences of stillness, sudden shifts of pace, humour, and moments where their movements evoke an animality of freedom and of the hunted. Crucially, they do not pretend to be a duck. They don't imitate or speak for the non-human animal. Instead, they move with duckness, with an attention to vulnerability and freedom. This distinction is important. It avoids appropriation and instead invites relational embodied reflection. The audience is simultaneously drawn into an aesthetic space and confronted with ethical urgency. What's happening here is not didactic, it's effective. It's not giving the audience information to process rationally, it's giving them feeling. Ambivalence, discomfort, beauty, and violence coexisting. That's where empathy begins, and that's where transformation is made possible. In Duck Lake, art and activism are not separate. The artistic choices are the activism. And this is what I want to emphasize. It's not about art communicating a message. It's about art doing something, materially and emotionally. A very different but equally powerful example is Soya the Cow, the drag persona created by Swiss performance artist Daniel Hellmann. Soya is a sentient, singing queer cow who exists between performance, protest, and cabaret. She appears at theatre festivals, queer venues, street demonstrations, and even academic conferences, often dressed in sequins, high heels, and udders, singing songs about milk, motherhood, and slaughter. What Soya does is disorientate the viewer. She's absurd, funny, and camp, but beneath the humour is a deeply serious intervention. Soya uses performance to queer the species boundary, to undo the assumed distance between human and non-human, and to foreground the trauma and agency of animal lives. She doesn't act like a cow. She becomes cowness in a way that is stylized, symbolic, and embodied. Through this drag, she opens a space of possibility, what we might call a post-human futurity. Can't say that word, sorry. Where animal life is not marginal but central, and not objectified but speaking, singing, and demanding. Soya the Cow also resists the demand for neat linear messaging. Her performances are layered, a satirical cabaret act, a political protest, a work of art. She embodies what I would call an aesthetics of refusal, refusing simplicity, refusing resolution, and instead creating space for empathy, absurdity, and confrontation to coexist. She is a cow that sings about love and capitalism and then turns around and asks you what milk costs a mother. I include Soya because she exemplifies the power of performance to subvert expectations. She doesn't just say something about animal rights, she is the disruption. And like Duck Lake, she moves us, sometimes through discomfort, sometimes through laughter, into a state of effective openness. Beyond the theatres or gallery spaces, performance also emerges in activist contexts, often without stages, lights, or scripts. One key example of this is bearing witness at slaughterhouse vigils. These actions are quiet, repetitive, and emotionally charged. Activists stand outside slaughterhouses, often at dawn, waiting for the arrival of animals. When the trucks stop, if they stop, activists approach them, make eye contact with the non-human animals, document their final moments, and simply stand with them. These moments are performative, though not in a theatrical sense, and certainly not in a trivial sense. They involve bodies, space, presence, and spectatorship. The performance here is the act of being there, being visible, and refusing to look away. It's an act of resistance that is as emotional as it is political. In my own work, I've developed performances that emerge from this form of embodied witnessing. One example is Box of Shadows, a durational installation in which I enclose myself in a confined space, accompanied by a live feed footage accessed through a performative scrapbook website. Audiences could also explore this space or observe digitally, and the intention was not to represent suffering, but to create a space in which the feeling of constraint, exposure, and complicity was brought to the fore. Another work, Anti-Hunt, was a 6-hour treadmill performance exploring the entangled embodiment of activist and hunted fox. Again, the point was not imitation, but alignment, inviting audiences to feel the exhaustion, vulnerability, and persistence of both human and non-human resistance. What these performances do is collapse the separation between activism and art. They're not symbolic, they're strategic, emotional, and material. They turn activists and performers' bodies into a site of confrontation, and they use duration, repetition, and silence as tools for empathy and ethical rupture. So how does this connect with education, with advocacy, and with meaningful change? What I've observed both through research and experience is that performance operates on a different register from traditional educational strategies. It doesn't only inform, it transforms. In advocacy, we often rely on facts about suffering, sentience, environmental damage. And while this information is important, it doesn't always move people. Performance does something different. It brings the body into the conversation. It activates not just cognition, but sensation. Empathy, I would argue, emerges not only through knowing, but through feeling. And performance invites that feeling by offering encounters with vulnerability and ambiguity, and with our own complicity. In participatory workshops, interviews, and focus groups I facilitate with activists, educators, and general public, we've explored what it means to inhabit the position of the non-human animal, not by pretending to be them, but by exploring what vulnerability feels like, what it means to be looked at, caged, silenced, or erased. These exercises are not about creating solutions, they're about opening ethical space. Performance becomes a rehearsal for empathy, not in the sentimental sense, but in a deeper embodied sense of responsiveness. This is where performance becomes a tool not only for public education, but for cultural transformation. It engages the whole person, intellect, body, and emotion, and invites them into a space where action becomes imaginable. And when performance reaches beyond the stage, into the protest, the school, the farm, and the vigil, it starts to intervene in lived systems of injustice. It builds bridges between the personal and the political, the human and the more than human. So to bring this together, I want to turn to a concept that I think captures the political and effective force of performance. Potentia, as articulated by Veronica Gago, potentia refers not to hierarchical or institutional power, but to a power rooted in capacity, relation, and movement. It is the power to do, to affect and be affected. It resists domination and instead affirms interconnectedness, an agency that arises from below, from bodies in motion, from collective presence. I think performance, especially when it's activist, embodied and grounded in care, enacts potentia. It's not just representational, it's relational. When a body moves through a public space in resistance, or when an audience is unsettled by a performance that refuses closure, or when a protest becomes a dance, a ritual, or a spectacle, these are not side effects, these are acts of potentia. This kind of performance embraces indeterminacy. It is not always strategic in the traditional sense. It does not always work by measurable standards, but it creates cracks. It disrupts expectations, it feels. And in those cracks, in those ruptures, something new can begin to grow. In my work, I see performance not as a tool to convince, but as a space to encounter other beings, other modes of perception, other ways of being human or not being human. Potentia invites us to stay with the discomfort, to hold the space of ambiguity, and to trust that something important can happen in that space. These are images from examples of performance and activism. And the wonderful speciesism WTF is going to be speaking tomorrow, I think, Stephanie. So hopefully you'll get some more information about that and some examples there as well. So to conclude, performance is not just a reflection of change, it is a form of change. It doesn't simply represent ideas, it enacts them. In the context of animal rights and ecological justice, performance can disrupt dominant narratives, challenge species hierarchies, and open space for new relationships between humans and the more than human world. Whether it's disturbing and juxtaposing beauty of Duck Lake, a radical joy and disruption of Soya the Cow, or the quiet force of standing beside a truck at dawn, performance can touch us in places that data and arguments cannot. It can help us feel our complicity, but more importantly, it can help us feel our capacity to act, to resist, to relate differently. As activists, as artists, educators, and witnesses, we have the opportunity to use performance not just as a form of storytelling, but as a practice of interspecies solidarity, a practice that stays with the trouble, that refuses resolution, and that dares to imagine futures where justice is no longer reserved for the human alone. Thank you very much. And that's my website, performedanimalrights.org.